want to tell you something that took me 3 years to say out loud. Not because I was ashamed, not because I didn't know the truth, but because when your own child becomes the source of your deepest pain, there's a particular kind of silence that settles over you. A quiet that feels almost sacred. Like if you speak it, you'll break something that can never be put back together. My name is Carol. I'm 64 years old. I have gray hair that I stopped coloring 6 years ago, and I have a kitchen with yellow curtains that I sewed myself in 1987. I have a house that I bought with my own 2 hands, not metaphorically. Literally. I was a licensed practical nurse for 31 years. I worked night shifts. I worked holidays. I worked through a broken wrist one winter because we needed the overtime and there was nobody to cover my floor. I want you to understand who I am before I tell you what happened to me. Because what happened to me was not the story of a weak woman. It was the story of a woman who loved so completely, so without condition, that she couldn't see, for a long time, that the person she was loving had quietly decided she was in the way. That person was my son, Daniel, my only child. The boy I raised alone after his father left when Daniel was 7 years old. The boy I drove to every baseball practice, every school play, every emergency room visit at 2 in the morning. The boy I put through college by working double shifts and eating peanut butter sandwiches 3 nights a week because I wanted him to have everything I never had. He was 38 when this story began, and he had just gotten married. Her name was Renee. I want to be careful how I describe her, because I am not a woman who blames other women for the choices men make. Daniel made choices. Renee may have influenced them, whispered into certain silences, repositioned certain ideas. But Daniel's hands were the ones that signed the papers. Daniel's voice was the one that said the words. So I will speak about Renee honestly, but I will not make her the villain of a story that belongs to my son. What I will say is this. Renee was 31 years old, very pretty, very organized, and very certain about what kind of life she wanted. She wore linen. She used words like aesthetic and intentional living. She had a Pinterest board for every room in a house she didn't yet own. She was not a bad person. She was a person who wanted specific things, and my son wanted to give them to her, and I happened to be standing directly in the path of what she wanted. That path was my house. The house sits on a quiet street in a small Ohio town. 3 bedrooms, a covered porch, a backyard with an old oak tree that Daniel used to climb as a boy. I have a garden along the left side fence, tomatoes, basil, marigolds. The kitchen has those yellow curtains and a window that faces east, so in the mornings the light comes in warm and slow, and it feels like the whole day is going to be gentle. I bought this house in 1998 for $87,000. I paid it off in 2019. That last payment, I remember sitting at that kitchen table and writing that check and feeling something in my chest release. Like a knot that had been there so long I'd stopped noticing it. It was mine. Completely, entirely, legally mine. There was no asterisk. There was no condition. There was no one on that deed but Carol Jean Whitfield. I want you to hold on to that. The deed, the name on it, will come back to it. Daniel and Renee got married in September of that year. It was a beautiful wedding. I wore a blue dress. I danced. I cried the right kind of tears. I held Renee's hands at the reception and I told her sincerely that I was so happy my son had found someone to build a life with. I meant it. I really did. The trouble started about 4 months later. It started small. It always starts small. Daniel called me one Sunday evening, not to chat, the way he used to, but with that particular tone that means a conversation has been prepared in advance. You know that tone if you've ever been on the receiving end of it. There's a slight flatness to it, a rehearsed quality. Like someone reading from a script they've memorized but are pretending is spontaneous. He asked how I was doing. We talked about nothing for maybe 3 minutes. And then he said, "Mom, Renee and I have been talking. We were thinking, since the house is so big and it's just you alone in it, maybe it would make more sense if we moved in and you could move into something smaller. something more manageable. I didn't say anything for a moment. More manageable, I repeated back to him. You know what I mean, he said. A condo, maybe, something with less upkeep. You wouldn't have to worry about the yard, the roof, all that maintenance. I said, Daniel, I like my yard. I planted that yard. He said, I know, Mom. We're just thinking about what's practical. I told him I would think about it. I hung up the phone and I sent. Oohed in my kitchen for a long time, looking at the yellow curtains, and I felt the first small tremor of something I didn't yet have a name for. Practical. That word became a kind of theme over the next several months. Renee called it practical when she suggested I donate most of my furniture because it was dated. Daniel called it practical when he mentioned, in a very casual way, that if I moved to a condo, he and Renee could keep the neighborhood consistent, by which he meant they could use the house, my house, the house I paid for, as their own starting point. They came to visit in February. Renee walked through my room slowly, the way a person walks through a house they're already measuring. She stood in the doorway of the back bedroom, the one I use as a sewing room, and she said, "This would make a beautiful nursery." She said it to Daniel, not to me, but she said it while I was standing right there. I went to the kitchen and I made coffee. I kept my face very still. That night, after they left, I sat on my porch in the cold and I thought about my mother. She had been moved out of her home by well-meaning relatives when she was 70, put in a smaller apartment. More manageable, they'd said. She was dead within 18 months, not from any illness that anyone could name, just from a kind of quiet extinguishing, like a candle that had been moved away from the window. I was not going to be that candle. Spring came, the tomatoes went in. The marigolds came back on their own, the way they always do, volunteers from last year's seeds. I love that about marigolds. They don't wait to be invited back. The calls from Daniel became more frequent, but the warmth in them became thinner. There was always an agenda underneath, always a nudge. He started sending me real estate listings. Little condos, one-bedroom apartments, senior communities. He framed them as gifts. Look at this one, Mom. It has a nice patio, but I understood what they were. They were a campaign. One evening he came alone, without Renee, and I thought maybe we would just have dinner, just be mother and son for a few hours. I made pot roast. I set the table with the good plates. He ate and he smiled and he talked about work, and I thought, okay, here he is, my boy, still in there. Then after dinner, over coffee, he slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a document, a quitclaim deed. He had already had it prepared. If you sign this, he said carefully, it would transfer the house into both of our names, just as a precaution. In case something happens to you, then we wouldn't have to deal with probate. I looked at the paper, I looked at him. In case something happens to me, I said. You're 63, Mom, it's good to plan. I am a woman who has worked in healthcare for 31 years. I know what a quitclaim deed is. I know what it does. I know that it does not protect the person who signs it. It transfers ownership. Quietly, cleanly, without the usual legal protections of a proper sale or inheritance agreement. I folded the paper in half. I put it on the counter beside the sink. I'll look it over, I said. He smiled, he helped clear the table. He kissed me on the cheek when he left. I stood at the window and watched his car pull away. And the something that I hadn't yet named settled into me fully, cold and clear as winter water. My son was trying to take my house. I didn't confront him, not yet. This is something I want to explain because people sometimes ask, why didn't you just say something? Why didn't you call him out right then? Because I needed to understand the shape of it first. I needed to know how far it had gone, who was involved, what the plan actually was. A woman who acts in anger gives away her hand. A woman who waits and watches and learns, she keeps hers. So I watched. I started keeping notes. Not dramatic notes, just a small notebook in my nightstand where I wrote down dates and conversations. What was said? What was implied? I wrote down the real estate listings he'd sent with dates. I wrote down Renee's comment about the nursery. I wrote down the quitclaim deed, the date he'd brought it, the name of the notary printed at the bottom, because it had already been notarized on his end, which meant this had been planned for some time. I called my neighbor Barbara, who has been my friend since 1994, and I told her quietly what was happening. Barbara is 71 and has seen everything. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished she said, "Carol, you need a lawyer." I said, "I know." I called a lawyer the next morning. Her name was Margaret Holloway. She was in her late 50s, solid and practical, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a manner that reminded me of the best charge nurses I'd ever worked with. She listened to everything I told her, looked at copies of the documents I'd brought, and then she leaned back in her chair and she said, "The good news is you haven't signed anything." "I know," I said. "The other good news," she said, "is that this house is yours, free and clear, and there is not a single legal mechanism by which your son can take it from you without your consent." I exhaled. "But," she said, and I knew there would be a but, people in these situations sometimes get worn down. They get isolated. They get made to feel like a burden. And eventually they sign something just to have peace. That's what we want to prevent. She helped me do two things that afternoon. First, she drafted a simple letter, not threatening, just factual, that established my clear understanding of my property rights and my intention to retain sole ownership. Second, she helped me update my will and establish a living trust, which would protect the house from any future contested claims and ensure it passed according to my wishes, not anyone else's convenience. I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Solid, like ground beneath my feet again. The campaign continued. I want to be honest about how painful it was, even after I had taken my quiet legal steps, because knowing what someone is doing to you doesn't stop it from hurting. You can understand a wound perfectly and still feel it. Daniel called less to talk and more to manage. His calls had the quality of check-ins, the way you might call a situation rather than a person. He asked about my health with a frequency that felt less like love and more like inventory. He mentioned twice that he knew someone at a senior living community in Columbus, really lovely mom, very active, lots of people your age, and both times I listened politely and said I was happy where I was. Renee stopped coming to the house entirely. I noticed this. There was a coldness in her absence, as though she had decided the negotiation was beneath her now, that Daniel would handle the logistics, that she would simply wait. I kept planting my garden. I kept making my pot roast. I kept sewing at the machine in the back bedroom. I kept living in my house as though it were my house, because it was. But the loneliness of it was real. I want to say that plainly, because I think sometimes people expect older women to be immune to loneliness, as though age builds a wall around the heart. It doesn't. If anything, the heart gets more tender with time, more sensitive to absence. I missed my son. Not the man who was calling me with agendas, but the boy who used to fall asleep on this couch watching baseball. I missed him the way you miss someone who is still alive, which is its own particular grief. The major moment happened on a Thursday evening in October. I had not been expecting them. Daniel hadn't called ahead. I heard the car in the driveway and I went to the door and there they were, Daniel and Renee, and two other people I didn't recognize. A man and a woman, both carrying clipboards and wearing the particular expression of people doing professional assessments. Renee said, cheerfully, "Hi, Carol, we were in the neighborhood. We brought some friends, they do home valuations. We thought it might be useful to know what the house is worth these days, for planning purposes." They were on my porch, they had clipboards, they were looking at my porch columns, my front door, my garden. I am not a woman who yells. I have never been a woman who yells. But I felt something move through me in that moment, not hot, not explosive, but very, very cold and very, very clear. I said calmly, "This is my home. You don't have my permission to assess it." Daniel said, "Mom, we're just—" "Daniel," my voice was quiet, quieter than normal. I have found in my life that the quieter I speak, the more carefully people listen. "I need you to hear me. This is my house. I own it. No one may assess it, evaluate it, measure it, or plan around it without my knowledge and my consent. Do you understand what I'm saying?" The two assessors looked at the ground. Renee's smile had gone somewhere. Daniel looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was part guilt, part frustration, and part something that looked almost like a child who has been caught. That expression told me everything I still needed to know about how conscious he was of what he was doing. He said, "We'll talk later." I said, "Yes, we will." They left. I closed my front door. I went to the kitchen. I stood at the sink and I washed 2 cups that didn't need washing, and I watched the water run and I breathed. The call from Daniel came 2 days later. He led with apology, not a full one, not a clean one, but the modified kind that says "I'm sorry you felt that way" rather than "I'm sorry I did that." He said he was only trying to help. He said Renee was worried about me being alone. He said the house was a lot for one person. He said he thought I'd eventually come around. I let him talk. I have learned to do this, not because I have nothing to say, but because it is useful to hear how far a person will go when they're not interrupted. He went quite far. When he was finished, I said, "Daniel, I'd like you to do something for me. I'd like you to think back to 1998 when I bought this house. Think about how old you were. You were 12. Think about what I was doing then. Working nights. Packing your lunch before I left. Making sure your neighbor Mrs. Patterson had a key so someone could be there when you got home from school. Think about what this house has been." He was quiet. "I am 64 years old," I said. "I am healthy. I am capable. I am not a problem to be solved. And this house is not an asset to be redistributed. It is my home. I need you to understand that what you've been doing, the listings, the deed, the appraisers on my porch, none of that came from love. Whatever you want to tell yourself, those were not the actions of a son looking after his mother." Another quiet. Then, softer than I expected, "I just thought you'd want to be closer to us." I said, "If you wanted me closer, Daniel, you would have invited me to dinner. You would have called to hear my voice. You would have asked what I needed. You didn't do any of those things. You tried to take my house." The silence that followed that sentence was long. I want to pause here and talk about the thing I found. A few weeks before that phone call, while I had still been in my quiet observation period, I was going through some old papers, insurance documents, utility records, the kind of sorting you do when the weather turns cold and you want the house in order. I found, in a folder in my filing cabinet, a letter. It was in Renee's handwriting on her monogrammed stationery. It had apparently been left behind during one of their visits, slipped between some papers, perhaps by accident, perhaps not. It was a letter she had written to Daniel. An actual handwritten letter, which people rarely write anymore. I don't know if she gave it to him or kept it as a draft, but here is what it said, essentially, in her careful looping script. That the house was wasted on just one person. That Daniel needed to step up and handle this. That she had done the research, and there were options for women her age. That if he truly loved her, and here I had to set the letter down for a moment and breathe, if he truly loved her, he would find a way to make this work. Find a way to make this work. I held that letter for a long time. I felt the full weight of it. Not just what it said about Renee, but what it said about my son. Because he had received this letter, or some version of this conversation, and rather than defend his mother, rather than say, "My mother is a person, not an obstacle," he had started sending me real estate listings. I placed the letter carefully in a folder. I put the folder in my fireproof lockbox alongside my deed and my updated will and my living trust documents. Evidence not for a lawsuit, not for a confrontation, just for clarity. Just so that I, and perhaps someday Daniel, could not pretend that certain things hadn't been exactly what they were. The confrontation, when it fully came, was quieter than people might expect. I asked Daniel to come over alone. No Renee. A Sunday afternoon. I made lunch, his favorite, turkey with good bread and the Dijon mustard he's always liked. I set the table with the regular plates, not the good ones, because this wasn't a ceremony. It was a conversation between a mother and a son who had lost their way to each other. He came, he looked tired. He ate. We talked about nothing for a while, the way families do when they're working up to the real thing. Then I got up and I came back to the table with the lockbox. I didn't open it dramatically. I just set it on the table beside my coffee cup. I told him what was in it, the deed in my name alone, the living trust established and legal, the updated will, and the letter. His face changed when I mentioned the letter. I said, I'm not going to show you the letter. I'm not trying to destroy your marriage, but I need you to know that I found it. And I need you to know that I understand, now, what these past months have really been about. He looked at his hands. He was 38 years old and he looked, in that moment, like a boy. I never wanted you to lose your house, he said, quietly. You tried to put an appraisal on it without asking me. I know. You had a quitclaim deed prepared. I know. You sent me listings for senior apartments every other week. He didn't say anything. I said, Daniel, I need you to tell me something true. Did you actually want me out of this house, or did someone else want you to want that? The question sat between us. He said finally, it's complicated. I said, no, it isn't. It's actually very simple. Either you wanted your mother out of her home, or you let someone convince you it was okay to try. Which one is it? His jaw worked. He was trying not to cry. I know my son's face. I have watched it since he was born. He said, I'm sorry, Mom. Not I'm sorry you felt that way, just I'm sorry. It wasn't everything. It didn't fix everything. But it was real, and it was his, and I put it somewhere careful inside myself. There were weeks of strange quiet after that Sunday. Daniel and Renee had what I can only assume were significant conversations of their own. There were 2 weeks where he didn't call at all. Then he called, and we talked about ordinary things, about the weather, about a show we'd both been watching. Not about the house. Not about Renee. Just the two of us, finding the old frequency again, the one that had existed before all of this. Barbara came over for coffee one December morning and sat at my kitchen table and said, Well, what happened? I said, he apologized. She said, that's something. I said, it's more than I expected. She looked at me with the particular wisdom of a 71-year-old woman who has been through her own versions of this and said, You know it might happen again, not the same way. But people don't change completely just because they got caught. I said, I know, but I'm not afraid of it now. I know what I'm dealing with. She nodded. She poured more coffee. Outside, my garden was winter bare, just cold brown earth and the bare canes of the marigolds waiting for spring. Here is what I want to tell you about Renee. About 6 months after all of this, she and Daniel came to dinner, a real dinner, invited on a Saturday. She was quieter than usual, more careful. She helped clear the table without being asked. At the end of the evening, she stood in the kitchen with me while Daniel was in the other room, and she looked at the yellow curtains and she said, I like these. I said, I made them, 1987. She looked at me for a moment. I'm sorry, she said, just that, just 2 words. I don't know how much she meant them. I don't know the full depth of her understanding. But I think she knew, standing in that kitchen, that she had tried to remove a person from her own home, and that the person was still there, still standing at her own stove, still the one who had set the table, grown the basil, sewn the curtains. I said, thank you. And then I asked if she wanted another cup of coffee, and she said yes, and we stood in the kitchen together for a while, not quite friends, not quite anything yet, but not enemies either. Just 2 women in a kitchen on a Saturday night, finding where the edges were. I want to talk about what happened to me on the inside during all of this. Because the outer story, the documents, the confrontations, the legal steps, that's all real. But it's not where the deepest part of the story lives. The deepest part is this: I had to reckon with the fact that I had raised a child who was capable of trying to displace me. I had to sit with that. Not just as an injury, but as a question. What had I missed? What had I failed to teach him? What had I done wrong? And what was simply the work of another person's influence on a man who loved his wife and wanted her to be happy even at his mother's expense? I don't have clean answers to those questions. I have some partial ones. I think I raised Daniel to be giving. Too giving, perhaps. He had watched me give everything for 30 years, to him, to my patients, to everyone who needed something. He had learned that love means sacrifice, but he had perhaps not learned to distinguish between sacrifice that is freely chosen and sacrifice that is taken without asking. I think I also didn't teach him enough about money, about the weight of ownership, of what it means to earn a thing over 30 years and what that earning represents. He saw the house as something that had always existed, the way children see everything their parents built before they arrived. He didn't see the broken wrist winter. He didn't see the peanut butter sandwich nights. He saw a house with 3 bedrooms and a yard and a mother who seemed to be just living in it. So I had some things to examine in myself. Not to absorb his blame, I was very clear about that, but to understand. And then I had to let it settle. I had to decide what kind of mother I was going to be after this. Whether I was going to hold it over him like a verdict or fold it into the ordinary fabric of our relationship and keep going. I decided to keep going. Not naively, with my lockbox still locked, with Margaret Holloway's number still in my phone, with my living trust fully in place, but forward nonetheless. My garden came back in the spring. The marigolds came first, the way they always do, those volunteer seeds that nobody planted, just arrived on their own terms. I was on my knees in the dirt one April morning, early, the dew still on everything, and I thought about the word volunteer. A volunteer plant is one that grows from a seed that was dropped the year before, not deliberately, just living its cycle, falling to earth, surviving. The winter returning, there's no dramatic resurrection, no announcement, just here I am again. I thought about myself in those terms that morning. Here I am again. Daniel came that Saturday and helped me put in the tomato seedlings. We worked without talking much, the way people can when they've earned a comfortable quiet together. He knew how to space them, I'd shown him enough times, his hands in the dirt beside mine. At some point he said, "The yard looks good, Mom." I said, "It always does." He smiled, not much, just enough. I have been thinking, since all of this, about what home actually means. I don't think it's just a building, obviously, but I also don't think it's just memories, the way people sometimes say, home is where the memories are, as though it could be anywhere, as though place doesn't matter. Place matters. The light through a specific window matters. The creaking of a specific floor at night. The smell of specific wood and old curtains and years of cooking and years of living. You can't just lift that out of one address and transplant it to a condo someone else chose for you. Home is the evidence of a life. It's the physical record of what you built and how you built it and what it cost you and what it gave back. When someone tries to remove you from your home, they are not just trying to change your address. They are trying to rewrite the record, erase the evidence. Make it as though your story happened somewhere smaller, somewhere out of the way, somewhere that better suited the narrative they preferred. I refused to let my story be rewritten. That refusal, quiet, legal, patient, dignified, is the thing I am most proud of in this chapter of my life. I am 64 years old. I am still in my house. The deed still reads Carol Jean Whitfield. The living trust still protects it. The yellow curtains are getting a little faded now, and I've been thinking about sewing new ones. Maybe a different color. Maybe a soft blue. Something that matches the new light I feel in the kitchen these days, a little different from before, a little cleaner. Daniel and Renee come for Sunday dinner twice a month now. Renee has started asking about my garden, genuinely, not as conversational formality. Last month she asked if she could have some basil cuttings to try to grow herself. I said yes. I showed her how to take the cutting just below a leaf node. She was careful with it. That meant something to me. I'm not telling you this is a perfect ending. I don't believe in perfect endings. I believe in continuations, in the ongoing, imperfect, sometimes painful work of staying in relationship with the people you love, even when they have failed you, as long as they are willing to reckon with how they've failed you. Daniel is willing, slowly, quietly, in the way of a man who is still learning how to be honest with himself, but willing. That is something, that is in fact quite a lot. There is one more thing I want to say. If you are a woman of a certain age reading this or listening to this, and you are in a situation that sounds even a little like mine, a child, a spouse, a relative, anyone who is slowly, gently, persistently trying to nudge you out of your own life, I want you to hear me. You are not imagining it. The politeness of it, the we're just thinking about what's practical language, the real estate listings sent with a smile, the assessors on your porch with clipboards, all of it is dressed up in the language of care, but it is not care. Care asks what you need. Care invites you in. Care does not prepare documents and call notaries and arrive unannounced with people carrying clipboards. You have rights. You have legal rights that are very real and very enforceable. Find a lawyer. Find a Margaret Holloway in your town. Make an appointment. Bring your documents. Know exactly what you own and exactly what it would take to change that, and then protect it. And do not, please do not, sign anything in the quiet of an evening just because you want the peace. Peace bought by surrender is not peace. It's just a longer kind of loss. I keep the lockbox in the closet now, on the shelf above my winter coats. I don't open it often. I don't need to. But I like knowing it's there, the weight of it, the solidity of it. My deed and my trust and my updated will and a letter in careful looping script that I have never shown to anyone except my lawyer. The lockbox is not about suspicion. It's not about bitterness. It's about knowing where you stand and being very, very clear that where you stand is yours. Every morning I wake up in my house. I go to the kitchen. I look at the yellow curtains in the east light. I make coffee. I am here, I am still here. And this, the stove, the window, the garden waiting outside, the creak of the floor, the 64 years of a life lived fully and on my own terms, this is mine. No one is going to take it. Not without a fight so quiet and so certain that they won't even see it coming until it's already over. If any part of this story touched something in you, something you've been carrying quietly, I want you to know you're not alone. Leave a word in the comments. Tell me something, even just, I hear you, or this is my story too. We're not alone in these kitchens. We're not alone at these windows. We never were.